Joe Harlan counted the money in his pocket for the third time that morning, as if the number might change if he willed it hard enough. $23. That was what stood between him and nothing at all. He sat on a wooden bench outside Louisville Union Station, his duffel bag resting against his boots, the strap frayed from years of use. He never expected to need this much. The sky above him was the color of wet cement, and a light drizzle had started to fall, but he didn't move under the awning. He just sat there, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together like a man praying, except Joe hadn't prayed in a long time. 3 days ago, he had a job. 6 days ago, he had an apartment. Now he had a one-way ticket to Chicago, a duffel bag packed in 20 minutes flat, and a phone number for a friend named Marcus who had said, over a static-filled call, "Yeah, man, my couch is yours." But only for a few weeks. Joe didn't know what came after that. He didn't know what came after today if he was honest with himself. The factory where he'd worked for 6 years had closed without warning. One Friday, everyone showed up to find the gates padlocked and a notice taped to the fence, thanking them for their years of service. No severance, no warning, just gone like the building itself had decided it was done with all of them. Joe had savings, but not much, and rent in the city didn't wait for a man to find his footing. His landlord, a decent enough guy but a businessman first, gave him 30 days. 30 days turned into finding nothing, into interviews that led nowhere, into savings draining like water through cracked hands. And so here he was at a train station, with a bag and a ticket and a version of hope so thin it could tear in the wind. He thought about calling his sister, but they hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since the funeral, not since the words that were said standing over their mother's casket, words neither of them had taken back. Pride was a strange animal. It could keep a man warm in front of others and freeze him solid on the inside. Joe zipped his jacket up to his chin and watched people move through the station. Families with rolling suitcases, a man in a suit checking his watch every few seconds, a young couple laughing about something private between them. None of them looked at him. Why would they? He was just a man on a bench waiting for a train, like 1,000 other men on 1,000 other benches. When the announcement finally came for his train, Joe stood, slung the duffel bag over his shoulder, and walked through the station doors. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and rain-damp coats. He found his platform and boarded the train, taking a window seat near the back, the kind of seat a man chooses when he doesn't want to be noticed. He put his bag beneath his feet and rested his head against the glass, watching Louisville blur and shrink behind him as the train picked up speed. 2 stops later, an old woman boarded. She moved slowly, gripping the seatbacks as she passed, and when she reached Joe's row, she paused, looking at the empty seat beside him. "Mind if I sit here, son? My knees aren't what they used to be, and every other seat seems taken by luggage nobody wants to move." Joe shifted his bag further under the seat and nodded. "Not at all, go ahead." She lowered herself into the seat with a small groan of relief, then let out a breath like she'd been holding it since the platform. She had silver hair pulled back into a loose knot, deep lines around her eyes that spoke of a lifetime of laughing more than frowning, and a cardigan the color of faded lavender. She smelled faintly of lilac and peppermint, the kind of smell that reminded Joe of his grandmother's kitchen, though he hadn't thought of that kitchen in years. "Thank you," she said, settling her purse in her lap. "I'm Eleanor, by the way." "Joe," he said, and left it at that. For a while they rode in silence, the train rocking gently as it cut through fields turning gold with early autumn. Eleanor hummed under her breath, an old tune Joe couldn't place, something that sounded like it belonged to another decade entirely. He watched the world blur past the window, and for a moment, he almost forgot about the $23 in his pocket. "You look like a man carrying something heavier than that bag," Eleanor said eventually, not looking at him, just watching the fields go by. Joe almost laughed. "Is it that obvious? When you've lived as long as I have, you learn to read faces, especially tired ones." He hesitated, then found himself talking. Maybe it was because she was a stranger, someone he'd never see again after Chicago. Maybe it was because there was something steady in her voice, the kind of steadiness that made a man feel like his words wouldn't be wasted. He told her about the factory, about the eviction notice, about the friend's couch waiting for him with an expiration date already attached. He told her about his sister, about the funeral, about words he couldn't take back even if he wanted to. Eleanor listened without interrupting, without offering pity, just listening the way people used to before phones stole every quiet moment. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You know, my husband lost his job once too. 1968. He came home and told me the mill had shut its doors. And he sat right there in our kitchen and cried like a boy. I'd never seen him cry before. Not once in 8 years of marriage. And I remember thinking, this is the moment that decides who we are. Not the job. Not the money. This moment. What did you do? We got up the next morning and started over. It wasn't glamorous. He drove a delivery truck for 2 years before he found work he loved. We ate a lot of beans and rice in those years. But we were together and eventually the sun came up on better days. It always does, son. Even when you can't see it coming. Joe looked down at his hands. I don't have anyone to start over with. Not really. Just a couch in Chicago. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. The leather worn soft at the corners. She flipped through pages filled with handwriting. Names, phone numbers, notes in the margins. I run a small program back in Louisville. Started it after my husband passed, God rest him. We help folks who've lost their footing, connect them to work, temporary housing, sometimes just someone to talk to on a hard day. I don't usually do this on trains. She laughed softly. But something told me to sit next to you today. She tore a page from the notebook and wrote down a name and a number. This is my colleague, David. He works with a logistics company outside Chicago, always looking for reliable men. Tell him Eleanor sent you. And when you're back in Louisville, or if you ever need to come back, you call me. My door's always open, and so is the program's. Joe stared at the paper like it might vanish if he blinked too hard. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I know enough, Eleanor said, patting his hand once gently. I know a good man carrying a hard season. That's all I need to know. The rest of the ride passed differently after that. They talked about smaller things, her grandchildren, the peculiar taste of gas station coffee, the way autumn always made her miss her husband a little more than other seasons did. Joe found himself laughing for the first time in weeks, a real laugh, one that came from somewhere he thought had gone quiet. When the train pulled into Eleanor's stop, she gathered her purse and stood slowly, Joe helping her up without thinking twice about it. Before she stepped off, she turned back to him. Call David tomorrow, not next week. Not when you feel ready, tomorrow, and call me too. Just so an old woman knows you made it somewhere good. I will, Joe said, and for once he meant it. She smiled, stepped off the train, and was gone, swallowed into the crowd on the platform. Just another stranger among strangers. But she didn't feel like a stranger anymore. Joe sat back down, the piece of paper folded carefully in his palm, and for the first time in days, the tightness in his chest loosened just slightly. He called David the next morning from Marcus's apartment, sitting on the edge of a pull-out couch that smelled like someone else's detergent. David answered on the second ring, already expecting the call, already warm in his voice like Eleanor had told him everything he needed to know. There was an opening, a warehouse position with room to grow into logistics coordination, the kind of job that came with benefits and a schedule a man could build a life around. Joe interviewed 2 days later, in a borrowed shirt Marcus had ironed for him, and got the call that evening that the job was his if he wanted it. He wanted it more than he'd wanted anything in a long time. 6 months passed. Joe worked hard. The kind of hard that came easy when a man finally had something worth building. He moved into a small apartment above a hardware store. Nothing fancy but his, paid for with his own 2 hands. He called his sister on a Sunday afternoon, his voice shaking through the first few words, and when she answered, there was a long pause before she said his name like she'd been waiting years to say it again. They talked for 2 hours. It wasn't perfect, healing rarely is, but it was a start. And starts were something Joe had learned not to take for granted. He kept his promise to Eleanor, too. Every few weeks he called her, telling her about the job, about his sister, about the small victories that used to feel impossible. One Saturday, nearly a year after that train ride, Joe drove back to Louisville, not out of necessity this time, but out of gratitude. He found Eleanor at her small office, surrounded by folders and coffee, cups and photographs of people she'd helped over the years, their faces bright in a way that told their own quiet stories of survival. Look at you, she said when she saw him, her eyes crinkling with the kind of joy that comes from watching someone rebuild themselves. You look like a man who found his footing. I found it because someone sat down beside me when she didn't have to, Joe said. Eleanor waved a hand like it was nothing, but her eyes glistened all the same. Sometimes that's all a person needs, son. Someone to sit down and stay long enough to remind them they're not invisible. Joe stayed for dinner that night, sharing stories with volunteers who had once been strangers on trains, in shelters and waiting rooms of their own hard seasons, all of them now threads in the same quiet tapestry. Eleanor had spent her life weaving. He drove home with the windows cracked, the autumn air cool against his face, and for the first time since the factory gates closed, Joe Harlan felt something steady beneath him, something that felt a great deal like home. He never forgot the $23, or the bench outside the station, or the rain that had refused to let up that morning. But he carried it differently now, not as a memory of what he lost, but as proof of how far a single act of kindness could carry a man, if only he let it. Some people believe that destiny announces itself with thunder and grand design. Joe knew better now. Sometimes destiny simply asks if the seat beside you is taken, and sits down anyway whether you answer or not.